Dr. Howard has taught at Valparaiso for 7 years now. Her book, Showing What Pregnancy Tells Us About Being Human, was published in 2020. She's also written for many other publications, most recently of which are the Comment, Commonweal, and Boston Globe magazines. Dr. Howard and her husband, who is also a historian, have 3 children. Dr. Howard is an avid reader and loves going for hikes and traveling. Dr. Howard's academic focus has been interdisciplinary humanities, specifically the history of family life and adulthood in the United States. While in Italy, she studied the history of religious women, particularly Catholic nuns. Her latest endeavor is to understand the effects of COVID on motherhood. Dr. Howard's research focuses on the culture of pregnancy, which she'll be presenting on today. Her hope is to extend the understanding of pregnancy beyond a purely medical scope into a deeper look at how formative it is for a woman's life and how these views have changed over time. Her presentation today is titled, What is a Pregnant Person Actually Doing? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Agnes Howard.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you, Valerie and Annalisa and all for having me here today. Is this mic in a space that's okay for you? Is that working? Good, okay. I want to think with you a little bit today about the title of this talk, What a Pregnant Person is Actually Doing, and I'm very interested to hear your own opinions on that, and we'll give you a little background and maybe something we can use to talk about together later on. When my friend Linda was pregnant, she had heartburn all the time. She was always wincing at this or that food and rubbing near her rib cage. Her mother-in-law tried to comfort her, saying, "Honey, I know it doesn't feel good right now, but be happy. It means that your child will be born with a good head of hair." Many women have had this symptom and have been told something like this for centuries. In only the last century or so, this explanation that heartburn earned one's offspring thicker hair would be dismissed as an old wives' tale by personnel who have cultural authority now over birth in the U.S., that is to say, doctors. Not that an OB necessarily has a better answer for heartburn or any one of the many other weird things that can happen to the female body while someone's expecting a baby, like curly hair turning straight or a sudden aversion to chocolate. Instead, a doctor might say that pregnancy just comes with some unpleasant side effects, and that's that. A doctor might advise women struggling with the symptom to make adjustments to their diet and activity, along with the many other adjustments to daily habits pregnant women are supposed to make. The patient may or may not reduce her heartburn, and she may or may not get a child with a full head of hair, but if she follows the doctor's advice, she is given to understand that she and the baby probably will come through the experience healthy. But, surprise, in a study published in 2006, medical researchers discovered that, lo and behold, women with more acute prenatal heartburn actually did have hairier babies. Doctors, one of these researchers quipped, would have to eat a lot of crow. The study's authors still could not say exactly why heartburn made babies hairy, but posited that do-it-all symptom of the human body, or do-it-all element of the human body, hormones. Hair did not trigger heartburn or vice versa, but all of the hormones involved in pregnancy functioned as a shared biological mechanism, their term, that caused both things, separately, with no relationship to each other. Why do we entrust pregnancy and birth to doctors? The obvious answer might be that doctors know something and can do something that helps bring mothers and babies more safely through birth. I note that I am not mostly interested here today in entering the battle that pits midwives against doctors in birth. I recognize that doctors and medicine offer life-saving treatments, and they can help a great deal. Significantly, though, the reason many women currently trust maternity care to doctors, pain relief, beeping monitors, fetal imaging, epidurals, did not exist before obstetrics assumed authority over birth. Doctors became the go-to experts for birth before they had all that stuff, not because they actually had those tools to help. Doctors cannot answer all the questions a person might have about her pregnancy, nor explain to the rest of us what a pregnant person is doing. The experience of carrying in your own morphing body a person you do not know but then release into the world, that ranks right up there with the biggest puzzles of human existence. What might that experience do to the person involved in it? And how should we all think about ourselves since we all begin this way? What we see in the case about heartburn, the lived experience of pregnancy symptoms, the search for an explanation, the waving away of curiosity through medical dictates, intrigues me as an entry point to answering the question this talk poses. What is a pregnant person actually doing? I want to think about some answers to that question, about what gets in the way sometimes of answering it well, and I hope to offer some constructive language to describe what seems to me the significance of the process, its implication for women, family, and communities. But a basic answer first. A person who reorients her habits through prenatal care is doing something formative both for the baby-to-be and also for herself, for the kind of person she is. That kind of language is not entirely alien to the way Americans talk about pregnancy, but it's not usual either. Way too often, pregnancy and birth get a sort of cutesy, sentimental idiom, or in backlash, a critique, sometimes feminist, at the way baby talk can essentialize or demean women. But I think posing even more difficulty than language that romanticizes or dismisses maternity is the language of medicine. The medicalization of pregnancy and birth can make it difficult to recognize them as morally significant experiences by tending to reduce human experience to the physical, by explaining important events in terms of risk and symptoms, by acting as though the doctor and machines, not the woman, is achieving the birth. And when the women's bodies are attended to appropriately, their bodies sometimes are treated as merely faulty machines, and by emphasizing outcomes and health in reductive terms that negate the process of both pregnancy and birth. Medicine and the bioscientific way of seeing that underlies it can help us regard birth better, but also can obscure understanding. I am not against medicine, doctors, nurses, and hospitals. But because of the way our culture tends to situate birth almost entirely within their realm, I believe we need to look beyond medicine to get a better sense of what is going on. I will try to explain how I think medicine can get in the way of seeing birth well in the past, how it has gotten in the way in the past, by knowing both too little and doing too much. But medicine also can open opportunity for better seeing by knowing more and doing less. So, how do I mean this? Knowing too little and doing too much, knowing a lot and doing less. First, in the past, medicine obscured the significance of pregnancy by not knowing enough about it. What I mean by this is that old views of pregnancy, really old ones, misunderstood some important elements of that process, which they referred to as generation rather than reproduction, the language we might use. This is not to say they knew nothing. They thought they knew a great deal, and they used the best tools they had of inquiry to figure it out. Nor does it mean that they failed to ask some very good questions. For now, let's say only that ancient people gave what seemed to us like very strange answers, with some very interesting questions about how babies were made. And most of those answers tended to be not very complimentary to women. Long into medieval and early modern Europe, understanding of birth was shaped by ideas from ancient Greece, a kind of mashup of Aristotle and Galen, both Greek philosophers, physicians, assuming that babies were made of what they both called seed. Aristotle said seed only came from men. Galen said both men and women had seed understood as a kind of immaterial substance, not matter, but something immaterial that caused new life to be. Traces of these views appeared in both elite writings and popular culture for centuries into early modern Europe. Whatever they thought of the seed, having one or having two, explanations of generation tended to cast men in the role of doing something important, while the woman was predominantly the receiver of that action and passive. So the key action and the key agent was the man and what the man contributed, and the key moment was what those prospective parents did there at the beginning in the act of generation, and not what women did for the next many months. Aristotle explained that the fetus would go through several transformations as the body changed shape with a soul appropriate for each stage, during which time the woman did pretty much nothing except allow her body to provide matter for the baby's growing body, inert as dirt, soil being one of the more popular uterine metaphors. The exception to this was the exception to this view of women's passivity was that women could do something to mess up the process. They were not thought to do much to create or assist the coming of the new human, but they could make things go wrong by thinking or eating the wrong thing, to interrupt what the man had started or what the baby was going along perfectly well doing by himself. Old views thus impeded what I think is a sufficient answer to our question by knowing too little about what was actually happening, and in the absence, by leaning on sometimes misogynistic assumptions of the mother's passivity to supply what was lacking in what they understood. These ideas, though, deserve two caveats. First, the point of highlighting strangeness in these views is not to congratulate ourselves on knowing something that our ancestors did not. Instead, the contrast, I hope, can help us see pregnancy as culturally shaped, which could alert us to our own culture's shaping of it. These ideas did raise some very good questions, even if their answers fall short. How should an occasion of this gravity and potential danger be best observed and supported? How should ideas about generation, about pregnancy and birth, fit in with the other things humans think are important, like creation, God's plans, or ties among families? Second, what passed as medicine might not have actually impacted the process of birth too badly, though men thought a lot about bearing and birthing children, since the question of how babies were made is one that touches on many other mysteries, philosophical, scientific, and theological. Through the Middle Ages and early modern period in Europe and then in American settlement, men had comparatively little to do with actual birth, which was for the most part in the purview of women. Women were medical practitioners in some respects, domestic and social, making remedies, caring for family symptoms, and above all, managing birth. Birth by midwife or midwifery, which is the term for these women as birth attendants, continued as the norm in Europe and North America well into the modern period. So, from knowing to doing, medicine can make it harder to think well about what pregnancy entails by doing too much. Because in the 17th and 18th centuries, during what were called man-midwife controversies in France and Britain and North America, births moved gradually in the 18th century and then decisively in the 19th, away from female midwives to the care of men, doctors in the 19th century, and then the growing professional guild of obstetrics. Birth by doctor in hospital became the norm in the U.S. by the middle of the 20th century, the majority of women giving birth in that context. A trend adjusted but not overturned by campaigns for more natural childbirth in the past couple of decades. Mid-20th century birth in the U.S. would be supervised by a doctor, delivery done in hospitals, often with general anesthesia, which is the way my mother had me and all of my 4 siblings. This model has features that some women liked and continue to like: a presumption of safety in case something goes wrong, plus medicine and tools awaiting whatever might want to go wrong, technologies to monitor and image the process, and a little something for the pain. This model of birth entrusts the whole of the process to medicine as both the source of expertise and problem solving. Medicine assumed supervision of pregnancy and birth so thoroughly by supplanting, taking the place of other patterns, folkways and religious habits and local traditions that used to advise women what to do about it. A mid-20th century maternity manual, for instance, titled Modeling for Motherhood, insists to readers that the doctor, not your grandmother or aunties or neighbors, should be the one whose word you trust, whose direction you follow when pregnant. After all, the guide admonishes, you wouldn't let an amateur tinker with your wristwatch. So why should you listen to pregnancy advice from someone other than your doctor? Medicine not only told patients what was important to know or not know about birth, but became predominantly the sphere where we talked and handled all that stuff, what we now call reproductive medicine. Patients still can think about pregnancy and birth privately any way they would like. You can still think of having a baby as receiving a new child from God, as awaiting that little special someone, as hoping the baby looks just like grandpa. But beyond the nursery, beyond the private four walls of your home, what's important about birth is determined by science and medicine. As ethicist Michael Banner notes, quote, religious meanings and rites in birthing have been displaced or pushed to the margins by technocratic meaning and rites. That is to say, claiming a doctor's attention does recognize birth as something important, but not in a way that regards a woman's actions in it. So if we think of those two categories, knowing too little and doing too much, as one's producing a negative or obscuring function in how better to see birth, we can think of two positive ways by switching those, knowing more and doing less. So knowing more about pregnancy and birth does carry a lot of promise, and we know a lot now that we used to not know. Knowing what is going on in utero and having some means to address problems that sometimes can happen during delivery creates space for us to see what is true, what I think has always been true about the process. 19th and 20th century discoveries about reproductive systems and hormones revealed that women actually are doing a great deal during pregnancy. This discovery, regrettably, did not have the immediate effect you might expect. Science about birth in the last century and a half or so has given us ways to understand how conception occurs, how the embryo and then fetus grow, which symptoms a woman is likely to experience, and how to prepare for birth. Such a revolution in understanding that women not only contribute fully half the stuff that you need to make a person, whether you call that seed or DNA, but that the female body does a great deal through the whole of the process, that shift might have made people think very differently about pregnancy and birth. It did not, unfortunately, quite do that. The problem here is not doctors per se, but with the scope of what medicine has claimed to do in the arc of reproductive health. If what women are doing during pregnancy and birth is mostly judged in medical terms, it is hard even to see what the pregnant person herself is actually doing. To see it, we need for medicine to do less. By the late 19th century, in fact, doctors were rebalancing this workload, who does what in the process of childbearing, with a supervising regimen that we would come to know as prenatal care. So prenatal care, this plan of having women visit doctors or midwives fairly regularly to have their blood pressure checked and some measurements made and due dates discussed. This is a process that's fairly new, and it comes in a development in medicine in the late 19th century. Because experimenting with tests and treatments to get ahead of some common complications, medical personnel, doctors and nurses, assign themselves things to check about their pregnant patients. And then they assigned pregnant patients things to do, increasingly many of them, with the implication that no longer was the mother to be understood just as waiting around for the baby to come, but could, should, and indeed must do a whole bunch of stuff to improve the baby's health and development. So for many American women, that initial OB visit is like clocking in for one's first shift on a new job, when the doctor becomes, quote, the boss of your life, in the language of that guide I already mentioned, Modeling for Motherhood. Pregnant women are at once told to do many things: eat vitamins, take vitamins, eat this, don't eat that, don't clean that, sleep this way, sit that way. But at the same time informed that there are no guarantees that what they are doing would actually produce the desired result, to make delivery safe and the baby healthy. Ironically, even as women were told to be active in pregnancy, doing all the stuff that prenatal care requires, they were still ascribed a kind of passivity, since what would really make things work is what the doctor did. I am very interested in these texts, these prenatal guides, that mediate a medical view of pregnancy and women's experience. Prenatal care guides, from those written by American progressive reformers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, to a big famous one printed by the a U.S. government agency called the Children's Bureau. It went through 5 or 6 editions and kind of dominated the prenatal care advice market for a long time, to the iconic late 20th century What to Expect When You're Expecting guide. My guess is that this has very much receded in popularity, but this really changed the language in the market of getting information about what was happening in pregnancy, to whatever you're using now, baby tracking apps or conversation with other women. All of these guides make a script for what women are supposed to be doing. Women are supposed to follow this in hopes that the outcomes will be improved when they come to the moment of birth. But measuring outcomes, some of which are very hard to assess until well after birth, is an unsatisfying way to describe the activity of pregnancy. What interests me is the striking disconnect between what women might feel in following prenatal care guidelines and what they could do and see in terms of fetal flourishing. And because the only kind of serious sounding language we have to talk about pregnancy and birth is medical, much about what the woman's doing gets reduced to health. A healthy mom and a healthy baby at the end of the process. And that's really all that we have to measure or assess. But being careful in the way that prenatal behavior is supposed to be careful can accomplish something for the woman doing it, too, and not only the fetus for whom she intends her efforts. A cynical view of pregnancy rules explains them as a form of social control that doctors and institutions use to manipulate women into clean habits by threatening them with birth defects if they do things they're not supposed to do, like smoke during pregnancy, drink during pregnancy, and not follow some other guidelines. And I think there is something to that. There is an element of social control, especially in some of the ways these mid-20th century guides were written. But I think that does not account best for what women themselves intend and attempt on behalf of the coming baby when they follow these rules. Women often want, we hope all women want, to help this stranger they're awaiting, and the rules given by prenatal care offer some practical things they can do to help. What does this prenatal care program enjoin a woman to do, and what effects might it have besides this possible payoff for the baby? A pregnant person is doing a range of complex relational activities, connecting the past and the future, embodying a union of 2 people and their families, changing the size and shape of her own family, and with it, the surrounding community. Of the practical activities, what to eat, what to drink, how to move, many of those guidelines can be sorted into 2 headings, I think: providing and protecting. Providing, by which I think we mostly mean eating, but not only. A woman seeks out, chooses, and takes in things that she hopes will supply the fetus, but also supply her own body to do this unusual work of maintaining the fetus. That's provision. Protection is her efforts to keep the fetus away from harm. Now, one could protest that the woman does these things involuntarily. Her body just does them. Her body just does what a mammalian body does. That is partially true, even as I hope we notice how astonishing it is that a mammalian body does what it does. The woman, though, also acts in order to promote and enhance what her body would just do anyway. She is conscious of what is happening. And this is, I think, the most interesting thing, and one that both sets us separate from other mammals and also from people in the past. Medicine knows so much now and teaches the average pregnant patient and the man on the street so much about fetal and maternal development that we are all quite conscious of what's going on inside, even when we can't see it. Even with involuntary processes, a woman carrying a baby is aware of them and agrees to live with them, even if they sometimes, like heartburn, turn out to be inconvenient or downright difficult or dangerous. So eating leafy greens and avoiding canned tuna might turn out to be important decisions a woman can make on behalf of a fetus, but they also matter to the woman herself, who can change herself in the way she acts during gestation. And her gestures of this kind matter to human beings in general since, again, more than most mammals, we are not only carrying our offspring for months inside the body, but we know we are doing so. And others who see the woman with this changed body shape also know that's happening. A pregnant woman is not only acting in formative ways for this fetus, but for others, and she's showing this. We need, then, a way to describe these transformative actions that goes beyond the physical and medically measurable outcomes. We could use a language that is not only private, not only meaningful inside of your own family, but uninteresting to those outside of it. For a usable way to describe what a pregnant person is doing in forming herself as she forms a fetus, I suggest we borrow from something woven for a long time into classical and Christian traditions, the language of virtue. We can trace this language substantially to Aristotle, who explains excellence of character this way, that doing well over and over changes the doer. Talking about virtue draws on ethical traditions that root human happiness in goods or ends specific to us as beings with reason. It describes traits that come through practice, not one-time doing, but through habit, repeating a right action so it becomes habitual, a second nature. Its reward is intrinsic, rather than being a task with an extra bonus tacked on like a prize at the end. That is, we get to have virtue by practicing it. Acting bravely is what makes you brave. Pregnancy fits this language fairly well, I think. Unlike the events that start and end a successful pregnancy, the process in between the 9 months or so requires attention and action over and over and over again in daily life. A woman must temporarily but pretty thoroughly reshape her practices, and these shifts, eating and drinking differently, moving and working differently, become habitual, at least for a time. Doing them, understandably, can be thought to change her, and the reward that comes out of her doing all this cannot be just the visible later effects on the baby, but what she becomes. What she becomes is not just a better prepared mommy, not just a more ready midnight changer of diapers or toter of snacks for toddlers, but a human being marked by care for another. Women practicing these things for 9 months strengthen their own abilities to be attentive, to be generous, to be courageous, and to share what they have. Of course, pregnancy is not the only way to develop these, but the time span, this length of time, the 9 months, is the reason I like to focus on pregnancy rather than birth, which usually draws more excitement for some people writing about these kinds of things. Now, I see that the language of virtue could be off-putting to many. To be sure, talking about virtues alongside pregnancy requires caution. Pregnancy itself is not a virtue. It only gives opportunity for practice of them. Nor is it the only opportunity. Humans have lots of opportunities of different kinds to practice virtue, and the virtue is not automatic. Nor should we equate female flourishing and female virtue with motherhood. Virtue gives a way, not a perfect way, but a usable way, to recognize the actions involved in pregnancy and the good of those actions without only stressing their consequences on the fetus. Virtue is appropriate to discussion of pregnancy, I think, finally, not least because the language of vice is so often applied to pregnancy. Women are frequently warned to stay away from naughty behaviors, like taking an extra slice of cake on grounds that she's supposed to be eating for two, or in the language of early 21st century pregnancy guide, the one by Dr. Oz titled You Having a Baby, the authors reassure, the truth is, dear mother, almost all of your vices will be forgiven because the baby's genetics and the doctor are in charge. So I think virtue can be useful for us. And in traditional language, there are 7 virtues, a kind of combination of theological ones and classical ones. There are lots of others, but I want to look at several that I think are fairly obvious in their relationship to childbearing. Temperance, or moderation, might describe the way of eating just enough. Charity or love might come in handy to name the kind of love one has toward a hoped-for baby. Hope, one of the other important theological virtues, is a bright, hard way between despair and presumption. It's necessary for us, I think, when symptoms discourage and fetal outcomes are not guaranteed. But I want to describe in detail two particular virtues that I think are especially interesting in talking about pregnancy. First, hospitality, and then courage. So, hospitality. Hospitality is highly valued in many cultures and in religious traditions. It is praiseworthy for some of the basis of civilization to offer generosity to a guest for the sake of the guest, offering a harbor from danger and giving comfort. Pregnancy fits well with this definition of hospitality. Pregnant women offer the fetus a protected space to stay for a while, ample share of whatever is at hand, bed, and board. When a guest comes to stay in our home, think about how this might have worked in your own house. We move furniture around, we prepare a room or a couch, we change linens, we adjust the plans of our day according to the needs of the guest. We often offer special meals. A pregnant woman does much of this same kind of work in the space of her own body. She does not just give extra room, but in the very nice words of philosopher Lisa Gunther, she contracts to make space for the other within herself. She literally makes room that did not exist before. Paradoxically, she becomes smaller inside her as her organs are sort of pressed in by the growing uterus, as she appears bigger on the outside. We all start in this particular place fitted for us. A mother-to-be gives the fetus a place to live on the earth, a shelter and provisions that in some cases, for this fragile beginning of life, are the best a child will ever enjoy. This is most marked in cases of poverty. Sometimes a woman cannot give her children, those unborn or born, what she wishes she could give. But she gives and the fetus takes. The fetus takes what she has of her stock of calcium, iron from her blood, the other nutriment it needs. Sometimes the lodgings a fetus enjoys with its constant temperature, its shielding from scorching sun or icy cold, its well stocking with foodstuffs, is the best that person will ever enjoy. The body does a lot of that automatically, to be sure. But how the woman moves, what she wears, how she bends to put on a shoe or reaches to hang up a coat, how she puts one foot ahead of the other, a childbearing person can be aware and can assist and manage the accommodation the body automatically offers. She can give more than just space. She gives welcome, ongoing welcome, hospitality. The second virtue I want to talk a little more about is courage. And courage, not surprisingly, is the classical virtue most often named in association with birth. It could mean straightforward fearlessness in the face of pain during labor, or danger, akin to the courage men show in battle. It's not just a matter of private bravery, but something that matters to other people. Plutarch, the Greek historian, reported that Spartan women who died in childbirth had their graves marked with a special inscription, honoring them in the same way as men who died in battle. But the courage of childbearing emerges long before the first contraction and comes in the most normal and healthy pregnancy, not just high-risk ones. Courage entails doing what is right at the cost to oneself. Pregnant women confront mortality, their own and their child's, and go to great lengths to shield a baby from harm. Historian Judith Walzer-Levitt recalls that earlier in American history, women sometimes described being pregnant as being, quote, under the shadow of maternity, recognizing that there was a possibility of death even with every birth. It is very good that maternal mortality is much rarer than it used to be in developed countries, even though, as news reports continue to show us to our shame, the U.S. rates for maternal mortality are some of the worst measures in among peer nations. Nevertheless, courage is engaged in pregnancies, even those that seem straightforward, with no fear of death or danger at the end. Women carrying an unplanned or unwell child might require special kinds of courage, and for some mothers, being pregnant includes the possibility of a child who dies through miscarriage or stillbirth. That kind of suffering is not easily compartmentalized away from, quote, normal pregnancies. Normal pregnancy opens the body to danger, to the loss of a hoped-for child, to discomforts and inconveniences and real sufferings. Not always. Ones that go well, though, occupy a continuum with ones that go with difficulty. It's a difference of degree rather than kind. And there are other ways still that childbearing might need courage besides the prospect of one's own injury or death. The very possibility that these things can happen when a new one, a stranger, is expected calls forth courage in the pregnant person. Applying the framework of virtue to pregnancy is not necessary for persuading a woman to do good on behalf of a child. She is already doing that. It is instead especially good for naming what she is doing. Wrapping up then, I would return to the language of the original question. What is the pregnant person actually doing? She is taking care through her prenatal behavior to nurture a fetus, but also her own character, her sense of self, and her capacities. She is doing so in ways noteworthy and often admirable. She is doing something important and showing it to us. That very unmissable fact of the pregnancy bump is a sign of this work. It is clear that pregnancy shapes women physically. That fact is in plain sight from sometime around the second trimester. The physical changes of pregnancy often get put in unflattering and even downright negative terms. Weight gain, stretch marks, and moms are often encouraged to get back to their pre-pregnancy selves, sometimes otherwise known as their old selves or their real selves. It's ridiculous, though, that what we want from an experience so long and important is to make like it never happened. Instead, we should claim a way to talk about what the expectant woman is doing that is not only physical, not covered just by a medical inventory of risks, symptoms, and outcomes. Pregnancy can reshape character and not only the body. Nurturing a fetus in utero is doing something for that fetus, but also for, on behalf of, everyone else, and as a witness to those who pay attention. And now I am especially interested in how you all might approach this question. What is a pregnant person actually doing?
Thank you so much, Dr. Howard, for that wonderful presentation. Dr. Howard's research encourages each one of us to be more mindful of the culture of pregnancy. This is important as it allows individuals to better care and support women who are pregnant. We can do this by finding better language to describe the significance of pregnancy and birth, understanding what stands in the way of that language, and learning how to address pregnancy and birth with more care and social support. We understand that pregnancy is more than just medical, and medicine both promotes and obstructs good thinking about birth. However, prenatal care creates a good script for women to follow, and the actions she takes does not just shape the baby, but can shape her. Taking this work and these virtues seriously encourages better support for all women during childbearing. There are many things that we can take away from this lecture, and as we consider these principles, we should reflect on what we can do to shape the culture of the communities we live in to best support women, especially in their time of pregnancy. I will now turn the time over to Bryce for our Q&A.
Okay, so if you would like to ask any questions, feel free to come walk over here to the microphone. And when you do, please state your name, your major, and your minor. And if you have any questions on Zoom, feel free to put in the chat, and we will also ask those alternately. So I'll turn on the microphone. So what life experiences in your career field helped you get to the point where you're at now? Let's talk about this issue.
So on this particular topic, well, I have been, in my graduate study, I worked on early New England colonial settlement, a lot of which is some fairly sophisticated family history and some history of the work of midwives. That's some of the books that we just have to read anyway. And it just struck me as really strange that I could read about that, but had really little experience in that kind of serious way with the people I knew who had had babies. Most of the time, what they talked about were kind of unflattering symptoms, like I said, with sort of spots on your face or funny things happening to your hair, or stretch marks, things that sounded like the experience was sort of boring, but also unpleasant, but also you got a baby. And that seemed so unsuitable to me. And then I had my own children. I have 3, and I've had a couple of miscarriages in between. And so that experience seemed to me to require much more than what I was getting. And I don't just say that in a kind of needy, I am a terrible patient. I'm a fainter, so doctors hate having me as a maternity patient. And I did mostly work with doctors, some with midwives. But it seemed to me that there ought to be some way of going through your days when pregnant with a recognition of just how, not just strange, but how meaningful this was. I mean, I don't know, anyone here have close relationship with somebody who is currently pregnant? So we know now, say, what day the lungs are really doing a lot of their development, or when the liver is developing, or how much a baby is supposed to weigh, or one of the favorites with fetal tracking apps is to compare fetal development to fruit or vegetables. So it's like a pea, and then a nut, and then a peach, and then what? I don't even know, like a papaya, I guess. Which is, it's not bad, but it's kind of ridiculous that the only thing we can do to match the lived experience of behaving really differently to your body is to like scrounge around for a fruit that might most resemble the fetus at that moment. I mean, if you have not been pregnant, I can say walking around assuming that you are the only person in your body is a great contrast to walking around with a body that has at least one other and sometimes multiple others in it. It's very strange, and to me obviously must have some theological meaning. And I guess I can close up. I don't want to make this too long-winded an answer, but my church wasn't much help either. I mean, there is a lot of institutionally religious and theologically inflected language about pregnancy, but it mostly has to do with ethical questions for when things go wrong, not who is God in conversation with when you are praying with a fetus in utero. So that's what made the project start.
Hi, my name is Sarai Romo. I'm a sociology major and I'm a global women's studies minor. And I had a question for you. So you mentioned how sometimes pregnancy and pregnant women are like bombarded with all this medical terminology and like eat this, do that. So I also am aware that there are a lot of communities that don't have access to, medicine, doctors, or even healthcare. And so I'm wondering if there's anything you have done, or if there's something that you know of that has been done for those communities that are not able to access those resources.
That's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I think there's a tension between the places where the complaint is too much medical intervention and the places where people die because they don't have enough medical intervention. I guess for me, the first thing that does is turn me away from language saying doctors are bad or medicine is bad. I don't think that, and I think there are occasions when it's absolutely essential. And I have been involved in some groups, mostly through church, but not only funding medical care in places that are underserved, or providing supplies to midwives, or whatever the other traditional birth attendants might be. But I think the fact of that experience, of women's experience in other places, can help provide a corrective for places that only know how to kind of throw more shiny machines at the problem. I mean, I don't think you should err too far on the side of saying birth is just natural, just let it happen, or too far on the side of, just plug in something else. But that's a really good question, the way the global experience provides some good contrast.
Thank you.
Hello. My name is Sophie Hurdle. I am a major in comparative literature and French studies with minor in global women's studies. And one of my questions was, I really appreciated this focus on the virtues, just kind of talking about how there are these qualities that we can develop, not only through pregnancy, but through other practices. However, one question that I have is, if we
lean too far with too much focus on these virtues, is it still possible to create a space where women are allowed to not express those virtues, if that makes sense? Like, if we focus so much on these virtues, is there still a space for women to not be patient in pregnancy, and how can we create that space for them?
Interesting. So, do you think we need to create space to be what's, well, I mean, there's a lot of literature about this, so it's very interesting, but how would we create space to be impatient?
Well, I think I mean, like, sometimes when pregnant individuals talk about their struggles with pregnancy, they are told, like what happened with your mother, just be positive, it's all going to be okay. And they're not really allowed to exist in that space of not feeling content.
Yeah, thank you. I really like that. On the one hand, there's this whole literature, I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, not academic, but like things that you could find easily in an airport bookstore about why women need permission to be bad moms or good enough moms, or why do women always have to be perfect and cheerful even though their snotty children are kind of crying all over them. I feel like we don't need that much. I feel like we already have that space, I guess. So I think we start impatient and cranky, or I certainly do, impatient and cranky and not very interested in first orienting myself to somebody else's needs. And there are certainly a lot of other ways to do that. So I think as a chance to practice those things, this can be helpful. But I think we do a lot, and I certainly do a lot of behaving the other way. So sure, I mean, lots of things during pregnancy and in mothering young children were difficult, and I don't think I was terribly well formed. And I also acknowledge that I think this language can be kind of risky because we also have a whole history of trying to shape women into kind of dutiful, nice people who don't have feelings and don't speak out. I mean, so absolutely, there's some space required to be real people. But the other thing I'd want to say is when I was finishing the book and I was talking to the publisher and I was meeting with these publicity team people, and the guy in charge of the publicity team said, well, I really, usually I bring books home and show my wife and family what we're publishing and what I'm working on, and I can't with this one because my wife hates being pregnant. She's pregnant and vomits a lot. She has terrible morning sickness. She hates being pregnant. She feels lousy about her body the whole time. And she would not like your book because your book sounds like it's saying something else. And I think, or my hope is that my book is really mostly for that person, because it seems to me deeply unsatisfying to say, you know what, lady, you feel bad and it's really horrible, but don't worry, you'll get a baby out of it. Because we can't guarantee that that baby is going to be great in proportion to how lousy the mother feels. And I think the experience of carrying life into being is hard work. And the fact that sometimes you feel crappy and you throw up is to me a sign of the hard work and not a kind of violation of it. So absolutely, I think that it should be taken seriously, and partially like the healthy, happy pregnancy language of prenatal care masks that, or at least doesn't find a way to walk through. So, you're asking exactly the right kind of question.
Thank you.
So this is from Maggie, and she says, I'm going to PA school, and my dream is to work in women's health and obstetrics. I'm sorry. Do you have any advice for approaching the issues as a medical provider?
All right. So I would be a medical provider myself, probably, if I didn't faint when I entered a doctor's office. The idea, it's not even the needle, it's the whole idea of the thing. I think the interaction of midwifery and medicine, and especially nursing, like that combination of specialties has done a lot of really good work listening to each other's strengths. So where one might be mostly attentive to making the birthing woman at ease, comfortable with what she's able to do, and feeling empowered, and another is maybe most mindful of risk, and another is most maybe equally attentive to the woman and the child. I think that kind of blend can be really helpful, not just in this kind of medicine, but in all sorts of healthcare. I think being aware of the history of your field is often something we overlook but is really useful. And that can help. I mean, medicine, especially obstetric medicine, really does not have a great track record with some of these things. But, you know, it changed, and it has changed a lot. And it changed somewhat because patients demanded it, because they were being cared for well by midwives and nurses. So that's, I think, the best sort of professionalization answer I can give.
Well, thank you, Dr. Howard. I think you all join a round of applause to make her.
Thank you.